Hi everyone! This week we crossed 10,000 viewers, a number I can't even comprehend. When I was in these same mountains just 2 months ago, we had barely 1,000 of you, and now it's 10 times that, which is just insane. And that got me thinking, if I had 10,000 of you in a room with me, what would I want to tell you? What story could I perhaps say that no one else could? And that's why I want to take a break from our regular history and philosophy content and instead share something personal with you. During the past year, I served as a humanitarian volunteer in the Kherson and Dnipropetrovsk oblasts in Ukraine, and today I would like to share my story. Now, before we begin, please be aware that this video is going to contain descriptions of war, sometimes graphic, and so if that's something you don't want to watch, I recommend you just switch off here. Furthermore, monetization and advertisements will be disabled for this video, so if you do see any ads, they'll be placed by YouTube and Google automatically, but not by myself. I'm deciding to share my experiences today for several reasons. First of all, I want these experiences to be in the historical record for anyone who may need them in the future. Second of all, I do think I want to provide a face to the suffering that I've seen, because I don't think it does it justice for it to just be abstracted on the news. Third of all, as a person of faith, I feel it's my duty to speak up about what I've seen. Fourth of all, I do think I want to honor those who are no longer with us today and can't share their stories. And last but not least, I think for anyone who's considering becoming a humanitarian volunteer, this video may help you and prepare you for what you may face or what you should expect. For security reasons, I won't be naming any organizations, locations, people, and as a matter of fact, I won't be sharing any photos either. Furthermore, before we continue, I think it's important to say that I did my work in Ukraine with pride, and I am extremely happy of what our teams could accomplish. At the same time, I don't put myself on a moral pedestal. I'm just as imperfect and flawed as any other person in this fallen world. To understand why I ended up in Ukraine, I do need to give you a little bit of context as to where my life was before my volunteering work. And to put it shortly, I was lost. At the age of about 19, I was diagnosed with cancer in my neck. And the treatment went fine, but it did leave not just a physical scar, but a mental one. I was acutely aware of how short life can be, especially in youth. Overall, life felt mechanical and without meaning. At school, I felt this immense pressure to count grades, and at work, I felt pressure to count invoices. Life had no soul, and it felt like I was just wasting the precious time that I had. I have to simplify the story a little bit for the sake of time, but I would go on to have a conversation with a friend that would turn out to be decisive. I confided in him my situation, and he asked me a simple yet devastating question. Why was I devoting all my energy to things that were destroying me? Why was I spending time with people that were using me? And in hindsight, it seems so clear, but in the moment, it really wasn't. That person helped me when he really didn't have to, and for that, I'll always be grateful. So if you're watching this, thank you. And so when another friend told me in late 2024 that he was going to volunteer in Ukraine, I simply asked if he needed a hand. And I explained to him that it would be my honor to do something so meaningful. He would go on to ask his group leader, who said yes, and so that's how it all started. There was something that kept ringing in my mind, and it was something my grandmother had told me and something her father had told her. He was a veteran from World War I. And that was, war is bad. That's what she would always repeat. Now, after experiencing everything I've experienced, in hindsight, I understand what they meant. And to be honest, there's nothing I can say in this video that's any wiser than what my grandmother and her father already knew 100 years ago, which is that war is bad. And I think that's what the point of this video is going to be. It's going to be me using my experiences and drawing from them to explain to you why their words have the weight that they do. So, let's get to Ukraine. I ended up serving in Ukraine on 3 separate occasions. The first was in Kherson in December of 2024, the second was also in Kherson in March of 2025, and the third was in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, and that was in June and July, so basically the summer of 2025. Now, before I get into what it was like being a medical volunteer in Dnipropetrovsk, I have to explain Kherson because that's where it all started. In Kherson, I assisted with the delivery of humanitarian supplies to an oblast that had been previously under Russian occupation. I was incredibly fortunate to have a good man as my group leader, a true friend who kept us safe in impossible situations, and someone who made me fall in love with his country. The locals had a dark name for what was happening in Kherson. They called it the drone safari. Russian FPV drones with cameras and grenades would go around and hit civilian targets indiscriminately. These were cars, they were people on bicycles, ambulances, humanitarian centers, really nothing was off limits. About a week before my first arrival, a major humanitarian aid depot was hit in the city. In community centers and schools, where I spent a lot of time with the children in Kherson, there were always posters warning about the threat of drones, which was very surreal. I distinctly recall one day where we heard that a woman about 5 minutes away from us, an elderly woman, was struck by a drone. And these were civilians, they were not combatants. The most intense moments were always going into Kherson city itself. You had to drive as fast as possible so that if there were any Russian drones, they wouldn't be able to hit you. The closest I ever came to the river and to the front line was around 15 to 18 kilometers. I distinctly remember one time when I was in the city, I got out of my vehicle and an artillery barrage began. I expected to feel panicked or scared, but I just became extremely calm and focused and continued in my work. At that point, we were retrieving some supplies. Later that same day, we would leave Kherson city and we were in a village nearby. And as I was doing some work outside, I remember hearing air raid sirens. And about 30 seconds later, a missile strike hit the city, and there were just clouds of dust and smoke. And it was a reminder that in war, distance is just an illusion. But what I'll never forget are the stories that the locals shared with me that I now have the distinct honor and privilege of sharing with you. Of course, Kherson was under Russian occupation before it was liberated by Ukrainian forces. And I got to hear what it was like when locals had to hide in their basements, when unspeakable acts were performed on women. And what little these people had, they shared with me, which I was incredibly grateful for and humbled by. The children of Kherson were incredible. During my first rotation in December of 2024, alongside other supplies, we delivered Christmas presents to kids and their families. And handing it to them and seeing their faces light up and spending time with them, it was the highlight of the trip and something I'll never forget. Additionally, I won't forget a young boy who had a moped, like sort of a motorcycle, and he would drive me around his village, showing me around. Now, you have to remember, this was a war zone where people are being hunted like animals, and this young boy was just happy to show this foreign volunteer around and what was going on in his village. So that was really awesome in every sense of the word. As I was leaving during my second rotation, the kids put together blue and yellow flowers, blue and yellow for the Ukrainian flag. And that was really amazing. You know, in a place where so much had been destroyed, they still were able to give something so kind to a stranger. And I think at the end of the day, that's what Kherson taught me. Even in the darkest of places, humanity endures. So my 2 short rotations in Kherson had offered some of the most meaningful experiences of my life. Yes, it was dangerous, but I finally felt a spark that I wasn't getting anywhere else. And so I just knew that I had to go back. That's when I stumbled across an opportunity with another organization that was doing medical evacuations in the Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. These were transports for soldiers, kids, and other patients. And I immediately said yes and tried to get there as fast as I could. This was a deeper and longer commitment, and what I would learn was that as hard as it had been delivering humanitarian supplies to Kherson, it was nothing compared to what I was about to experience. My role was to assist paramedics on ambulances during transport for patients. This included preparing medications, monitoring patients, and helping carry the wounded. My first ever patient evacuation went relatively simple. We had 3 amputated wounded soldiers, and we were doing something called a train evacuation. So essentially getting the wounded soldiers from a military hospital to a train so they could then be delivered to bigger cities for more specialized treatments like Kiev or Lviv. And I'll never forget, there was one soldier who was more wounded than the others. He had a complete amputation of his leg. And because of that, I had to help him to get on the train and carry him to get him to his bed. And as I got him to his bed, he gave me a fist bump and he said, "Good luck." And I gave him the fist bump back and I said, "No, good luck to you." And it was kind of a funny moment where the guy who had just gotten his whole leg amputated was wishing me luck. Then there was my first ever night call, which I remember like it happened yesterday. Night calls were essentially shifts where during the nighttime you would wait for some emergency and then you'd go pick up a patient. And as I recall, around 2 a.m, we received a request to go pick up a wounded soldier in the direction of one of the major fighting zones. When we arrived, I recall that as I opened the door of our transport vehicle, an explosion went off in the distance. This will be an important detail for later. I could feel the wind of the shockwave hit my face. And we began waiting for our patient at this military hospital. After about an hour, I want to say, a Russian Shahed drone began to fly overhead. You can tell it's a Shahed drone. They have this noise. It's kind of like a motorcycle driving really slowly. And then when it's turning, its engine will cut off. It was a little bit concerning because they do tend to target military hospitals, but it ended up flying over us, and at the same time, the Ukrainians, who basically what they have is they have these pickup trucks with these massive machine guns and spotlights, and they try to shoot the drone down. So there was this sort of machine gun fire in the background as well as the drone was flying overhead. After about 2 hours of waiting, so now I think it's about 3 or 4 in the morning, we get information that our patient isn't actually at this hospital at all. So it was a little bit frustrating, and that he was actually west of us. So we then went west, and everything more or less went smoothly. He was in a lot of pain, but we were able to give him painkillers and sedate him. The next morning, I felt I had still enough energy, and so I volunteered to take the morning shift as well. And we got a call really quickly to go back east to another military hospital. And we picked up this wounded soldier, and his right arm was missing, the entire thing. And so we asked him where he had gotten his arm amputated because he was wounded the night before. And he said he had received no amputation, that he actually lost the arm due to an explosion. And we said, where were you wounded? And he said, the name of the village that we were at the night before. And so now everything came full circle, and I realized that the explosion that I saw when I opened the door and the wind hit my face, he was the soldier on the receiving end of that explosion. And so I guess we were reunited, but it was terribly sad to see the result of that explosion, the human being who was on the receiving end. There is another memory I'd like to share, which was the night that Pavlohrad was attacked. I had frequented the Pavlohrad military hospital because I had picked up patients there, but that particular night I was not in the city. I was in a town nearby as I was doing night duty. And what I recall is that for several days it had been really quiet. No attacks at all. And so my gut was telling me, and I remember telling a friend, that I felt that maybe something was coming. That day I had performed a really long shift, and since I was going to do night duty, I knew that I had to take a nap in the middle of the day. So I was napping. I was woken up at about, I would say, mid-evening. There was a flyover of 2 Russian aircraft, and the Ukrainian anti-air defenses went ballistic. So that woke me up. I went back to sleep, but I was woken up again because this really intense rain and thunder started. It was horrible weather. And then I would want to say around 1 in the morning or 2 in the morning is when the attack started. At first, Russian drones came in from the north and from the east, and then progressively from the south and from the west, and it was all on Pavlohrad. They basically encircled the city with drones. After that came cruise missiles and ballistic missiles as well. The Ukrainian anti-air fire was vicious. It felt like they were firing anything and everything that they had. And it would continue until about, I want to say, 7 or 8 in the morning. So it was a long attack. I think what made it all particularly horrific was that you couldn't tell the difference between the anti-aircraft fire, between the missile strikes, and then the thunder. So basically, just regular nature. I felt particularly bad for the people inside Pavlohrad because it was just a real nightmare. When morning came, I learned that one of the major humanitarian organizations, that their headquarters in Pavlohrad had been destroyed in the attack, which was also a real shame. And, that was a civilian target. It was not a military one. My greatest honor, perhaps of my entire life, was transporting a wounded soldier from eastern Ukraine to Europe for specialized treatment. This was someone who had been through a lot, and he had a gunshot wound. The entire journey would cover around 2,500 kilometers and would take 40 hours. Now, of course, everything that could have gone wrong went wrong. We made it from eastern Ukraine to western Ukraine, but around Lviv, our transport broke down completely. And we were stranded for 6 or 7 hours. I felt bad because our patient was in pain, but honestly, he took it really well. That's just the kind of person he was. And we were lucky because we got another organization to basically give us a backup vehicle with their drivers. But it meant that only 2 people from our team could continue with the patient, and that would be myself and a paramedic. There are a couple things from this transport that I'll never forget that I will share. For example, at one point I was holding a medical instrument, to treat the patient, and it fell down. And with his gunshot wound, he went and he picked it up and gave it to me. And he told me, "We help each other." At one point, his pain was increasing, and so I asked him a question along the lines of, if you could have anything in the world right now, what would you want? And he responded, a cheeseburger and a milkshake. And I broke protocol because, you got to get a man his cheeseburger and milkshake. And I ordered our transport to stop at the next McDonald's, somewhere in the middle of Poland, I think. And I got him a cheeseburger and milkshake. And that was honestly just awesome. It was super fun. I think I learned more about resilience and dignity in those 40 hours than I could have anywhere else in years. Now, not all of our patients were wounded soldiers. One that will always stay with me is a baby with cancer that we helped deliver to get specialized treatment from Dnipro to Kiev. As someone who went through cancer myself, this was really important. It felt like I was getting closure. And I was in the presence of an excellent pediatrician and a kind and awesome colleague, both of whom were great natural leaders, and I learned a lot from. My last patient was also one of my saddest. He was a young man my age who had been drafted into the military and had a serious injury to his leg. He was psychologically very scared and afraid, and he kept drifting in and out of consciousness. And I think what made this patient particularly hard was that he would wake up and dial his father to call him, and then drift back to sleep, and then wake up and dial his father and call him and drift back to sleep, and that continued. I think it was about 5 or maybe more times where he would keep calling and dialing his father. Each conversation was brief and confused, and you could hear the fear in his voice as he tried to connect to home to keep his mind together. Watching him struggle to dial the number over and over again and explain to his father where he was and what had happened to him, it was the real face of this war. It was someone's son who was broken and fevered and just wanted to go home. And that was my last call. After that final patient, I realized it was time to step back. I received word that I got an opportunity to do something I always wanted to do back home, and so I took it. To anyone watching who was a civilian, a volunteer like myself, or a soldier caught up in this war, I just want to say that I've seen what hate does, and we have to actively choose something else. We have to take this pain and suffering and use it to push us forward, to turn it into something constructive. I refuse to let what I've seen and experienced turn me into a bitter person. And for that, I have an excellent example of the many people who I met in Ukraine who, even after losing everything, woke up and chose hope over hatred. When I make videos about history or politics, when we move divisions on a map, or when we discuss a leader's decisions, it's so important to remember that there is an untold amount of suffering that is paid for those actions, that at the end of the day, it's people who pay the cost. When I talk about this war with people, sometimes they tell me that war is a necessary extension of politics, that it's a part of human nature, that it's a part of nation states and geopolitics. And honestly, I would agree. But I think it misses the point, because I'm not here to make a logical argument as to why war shouldn't be. I'm making a purely emotional one. When a man loses his leg, his arm, his jaw, when a daughter loses her father, we can't just turn to them and say that it's a part of geopolitics. We can't tell them that their suffering is a part of how the world works. Beyond physical wounds, when a man returns from war, he can recover from physical disability. He can work through that. But he loses a piece of his soul. Inside, he becomes hollow. And he begins living in two places simultaneously. It's not just the real world, but it's also his nightmares. And these are men our age. And then they spend their whole life trying to find their way back to who they used to be. And I'm not here to tell you who's right and who's wrong. I'm not here to pick sides. What I am here to say is that my greatest fear is that this conflict should increase in scope and become an even greater human tragedy than it already is. This is already the largest war on the European continent since World War II. And let me finish by saying that I carry no hate in my heart. Christ teaches us to love everyone, especially our enemies. One soldier that I spoke to put it quite nicely. This was after he had a gunshot wound. And he said, they have their version of history, and we have ours. And now we do our job. And honestly, I think most Ukrainian frontline soldiers have more wisdom and they're more grounded than people that you find here in the West and on the street. And so that was my experience in Ukraine. If you wish to debate the current situation, the comments below are free for you to do so. You have your freedom of speech, and I have mine, and this is my exercise of it. But I'm afraid that we can discuss politics and history, as we do on this channel, and strategy, but at the end of the day, it just comes down to the simple thing that my grandmother and her father already said 100 years ago, that war is bad. And I hope through this video, I've now assigned real weight to those words, that war is bad. Thankfully, I think mine is now over.